Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. There are certain questions that I find myself asking over and over again in therapy. Sometimes I ask the question because I'm trying to gather information. Other times it's because I think the answer tells us something important about how we move through the world. Two of those questions are surprisingly simple. What do you need? What do you want? You might think those would be easy questions to answer. But for many people, they are some of the most difficult questions. Sometimes the answer is simply, I don't know. Sometimes the answer I get is simply, I don't know. Sometimes there's a long pause. Other times people will just say, I never really thought about it. Over the years, I've become increasingly curious about that because I don't think we're born without needs or wants. Children let us know what they need from the moment they're born. And as they grow, they also start to let us know what they want. They have preferences, interests, curiosities, and opinions. They reach for certain toys over other ones. They want to wear a particular shirt, or they'll ask to be held, or insist on doing something themselves. Those aren't just random preferences. They're clues about who that person is. So what happens and how do we lose that ability to know those things? How do some of us arrive at adulthood and genuinely struggle to answer two of those most basic questions that we can ask ourselves? What do I need and what do I want? As I've talked about this with clients, I've realized that wants and needs aren't the same thing. The way I would differentiate them is I think every human being has needs. We need food, water, sleep, shelter, safety, and connection. Those needs are universal. They're part of being human. Wants are different. Wants are much more personal. They tell us something about our temperament, our values, what brings us joy, what gives us energy, what feels meaningful, and what fits us. Our wants are often clues to who we are. So in today's episode, I want to get curious about how many of us lose touch with our needs, our wants, or we simply stop giving them much space at all. Because I think our relationship with our needs and wants tells us a great deal about our relationship with ourselves. Let's start out by talking about needs. As I've said, every human being has needs. We need food, water, sleep, shelter, safety, and connection. None of us really question whether those needs exist. They're simply part of being human. I'll use the example that if I'm thirsty, I get a drink of water. I don't usually stop to ask myself whether I should be thirsty. I don't criticize myself because I had a drink of water 20 minutes ago. And I don't wonder whether I deserve another drink of water. I simply notice I'm thirsty, I take a drink, and I go on with my day. Now, imagine you're sitting at a restaurant. Your water glass is almost empty, and the server asks if you'd like a refill. Maybe your body doesn't technically need more water. You're not dehydrated, but you're planning to sit there for another hour talking with friends, and it would be nice to have a full glass of water. You simply check in with yourself. and say, yes, I'd like some more, or no, thanks, I'm good. What's interesting is that nobody really thinks much about that interaction. The server doesn't feel rejected if you say no. You don't feel guilty if you say yes. It's simply someone offering. You check in with yourself and you respond honestly. Needs are often like that. They invite us to notice what's true for us in the moment. But I think many of us have a much more complicated relationship with our emotional needs. We wonder if we're asking for too much. We wonder if we should be over it by now. We wonder if needing reassurance, comfort, rest, understanding, or connection means we're weak or we're too dependent. Somewhere along the way, many of us stop simply noticing our needs and begin evaluating them. And that's a very different relationship with ourselves. I think one of the messages that can complicate our relationships with wants is the message to be grateful. Gratitude is a good thing. It helps us notice what we have, appreciate what other people give us, and recognize the good in our lives. But sometimes gratitude gets tangled up with the idea that we shouldn't want more. Maybe you grew up hearing things like, be grateful for what you have. Some people have a lot less than you. You have everything you need. Don't be selfish, or don't be greedy. Maybe those things weren't even said very often. Sometimes it's simply something we come to understand about our family. There's a difference between learning gratitude and learning that wanting more means you're ungrateful. We can be grateful for what we have and still want something. We can appreciate what someone has given us and recognize that it's not what we would have chosen. We can love our family and still wish something would have been different. We can recognize what our parents were able to give us and still acknowledge things we wanted or needed that they weren't able to give. Those things can exist together. For some people, though, the message, be grateful, gradually becomes, I shouldn't want more. And then wanting starts to feel greedy. Maybe our needs have been met. We have enough. Why would I want something else? Go back to the glass of water example. You're sitting at the restaurant. You've had enough water to meet your daily physical need. The server comes by and asks if you'd like some more. You could say, oh, you already gave me a glass. I don't want to be greedy. That would seem like a strange response. Maybe we want another glass of water simply because we're going to sit there for another hour and we would like something to drink. We really don't have to justify it. We can simply want it. I think this is where we can start filtering our wants before we've really had a chance to notice them. We can be asking, is this reasonable? Is it practical? Can we afford it? Will someone else be disappointed? Am I asking for too much? And shouldn't I just be grateful for what I already have? Over time, we might get very good at answering all of those questions before we ever get around to asking, what do I actually want? I've shared this story on the podcast before, but I think it fits here as well. As an adult, when my husband or my kids would ask me what I want for my birthday or for Christmas, my response was often, what are my options? One year, this was just a couple years ago, one of my daughters looked at me when I was asked that question, and she said, Mom, that's such a weird response. Why do you say that? You can have what you want. I immediately understood what she was saying, and I knew why that was my response. Growing up, what are my options was a very practical question. My family didn't have unlimited resources. Things were tight for what was needed. There were things we could afford, and there were a lot of things we could not. So it made sense to me to know what the options were before deciding what I wanted. But my daughter had started from a completely different place. Not that she grew up with parents who have unlimited resources. We also don't. But essentially, what she was saying was, why don't you start with what you want first? I think that's an important distinction. There's a difference between knowing what we want and expecting to get what we want. We can want something that's expensive. We can want something that isn't available. We can want something another person may not be able to give us. We can want something and then decide that it isn't really a good use of my money or my time. Wanting doesn't obligate anyone, including ourselves, to make it happen. We can simply still know what we want. I had learned to start with the parameters and then find my want somewhere inside of them. That was practical, and it served me pretty well. But practicality can also become a filter. Instead of asking, what do I want? I can often find myself asking, what makes sense for me to want? Or what am I allowed to want? What are the acceptable options? And of those, which ones do I prefer? Those aren't necessarily bad questions to ask ourselves. There are plenty of times when we need to consider what's realistic. But those questions are different from what do I want? I think part of becoming more connected to ourselves is allowing that question to come first sometimes. Not because we're going to get everything we want, but because the answer gives us information about ourselves. Losing touch with our needs and wants doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, when I ask, what do you want? They genuinely don't know. Others know what they want, but they've become accustomed to keeping it to themselves. I realize that's probably a better description of some of my own experiences. I wouldn't say I became completely disconnected from myself, but I do think in many ways I carried an unshared self. Let me give you an example. When I was in the 4th grade, my mom went back to work as an elementary school teacher. She had been home with us for several years, and she went back to work largely because our family needed health insurance. Health insurance had been a significant source of stress in our family. My mom had Crohn's disease. My older sister had diabetes. At the time, pre-existing conditions could make insurance complicated. So having consistent insurance mattered. She brought us into the living room and told us all that she had accepted a job teaching at our elementary school and she'd be going back to work. As she was talking about this, I began to cry. For years afterward, when my mom talked about going back to work, she would tell people that I cried because I was so sad that she wasn't going to be a stay-at-home mom anymore. I knew even then that wasn't the reason I cried. I was actually relieved that the insurance problem would be taken care of. I cried because it felt like just one more way that our family was different than the others in our neighborhood. But my mom seemed touched by the idea that I would miss having her home. So I didn't correct her, ever. I knew what I felt. I knew why I was crying, but I never shared it. Sometimes we don't lose access to ourselves. We still know what we think. We know what we feel. We may even know what we want. But we become selective about which parts of that inner experience we share. In another childhood memory of mine, my mom was just not very good at picking out clothes that I liked. She would buy me clothes for Christmas or my birthday, and I would open them and pretend I liked them. I would pretend to be appreciative because I knew that money was tight, and she had bought me these gifts. I also knew at the same time that I wouldn't wear them. And of course, she would notice, and then she would feel bad that I didn't like what she had chosen. I didn't like making her feel bad, but I didn't want to wear what she had bought me either. Eventually, I think this was either fifth or sixth grade, I negotiated with her. I asked if she could take me shopping and let me choose my own clothes. That way, she wasn't spending money on clothes I wasn't going to wear. I got clothes I liked, and both of us would be happy. She asked me, "But don't you want to be surprised?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her that it's not really a great surprise if it's not something you want. I just said I would rather go with her and pick out my clothes and other gifts myself. I did know what I wanted, and when it mattered enough, I would speak up. And I think that's worth paying attention to because sometimes when we talk about self-abandonment, we can make it sound as though a person completely loses themselves. That isn't everyone's experience. Some people lose touch with their needs and wants. Others know what they need or want, but have difficulty expressing it. Some people share themselves when it feels important enough while keeping other parts private. Some people become very good at deciding which part of themselves are worth bringing into a relationship. And often we do more than one of these. The work for some of us isn't necessarily discovering a self that disappeared. Instead, it's giving more room to the self that's been there all along and letting those parts be known. There's another reason I think it can be difficult to identify what we need or what we want. And that's that sometimes knowing what we need makes us vulnerable. I work with a couple where the husband has struggled with rage in the relationship. I knew this before I began working with them. His wife had moved out for a time and had recently moved back home when I had my first session with them. Early on, they told me that his rage only showed up with her. Their adult children knew that it happened, but they hadn't witnessed it. I told them in our first session that I suspected at some point it would show up in the office. Neither of them agreed, and both looked at me pretty skeptically. I think it was either session 3 or 4 when it did show up. He started the session by asking his wife something along the lines of whether she had missed him while they were separated. she began answering him, but she lived with his rage for a long time. So she wasn't going to jump immediately into the most vulnerable part of her answer. That made sense to me. It made sense to me that she started farther out, dipping her toes in the water, testing, and she was slowly making her way toward the answer. From where I was sitting, I could tell she was going to answer him, but that's not what he felt. He got angry, and there was his rage. He has a loud voice when he is talking at his regular tone, but when he starts yelling, that's a whole new level of loud. At one point, he was standing. I had remained seated, as did his wife. About 20 minutes into his rage, I asked him in a calm voice, "What do you need?" He yelled back at me, "Don't tell me what to do," which was interesting because I hadn't told him to do anything. He was answering a completely different question, which had never been asked. A few minutes later, he began to de-escalate. He sat back down on the couch and began to explain that part of what made him angry was his belief his wife wouldn't answer his question. I responded saying, "Well, we don't know that," because we didn't. He and I engaged a little more. He got calmer and calmer. His voice was actually quieter than I had ever heard it. I pointed that out. I said, "This sounds like the most regulated I've heard you." He could see the difference in his voice tone. I turned back to his wife and I asked her if she could continue with the answer she'd been trying to give him. She did. From my perspective, her answer was actually quite generous toward him. When she finished, I turned to him and asked, "Is that what you were expecting her to say?" He said, "No, I don't think so." I told him, "I think you were actually afraid of her answer, even though you wanted to know." Because when you think about what he was really asking her, it wasn't just, "Did you miss me while we were apart?" They had been separated largely because of his rage. To protect himself, he had also come up with reasons why he needed to be separated from her. But the question underneath his question was much more vulnerable. Can you still love me? That's a very different question than "Did you miss me?" We can become very competent adults. We can learn how to solve problems, take care of ourselves, make decisions, build careers, raise families, and manage all kinds of difficult things. And then we find ourselves needing something that competence can't get us. I can't make another person love me. I can't make someone miss me. I can't make them forgive me. And I can't guarantee that if I tell someone what I need, they'll be able or willing to give it to me. Often, what we need requires us to reveal something vulnerable about ourselves and then tolerate not knowing what the other person will do with it. I think sometimes it's easier to just be angry. It's easier to criticize or withdraw. Sometimes it's easier to convince ourselves that we don't need anything. Because saying, "I need to know that I still matter to you. I want to know if you miss me. I need reassurance. And I want to feel close to you," puts us in a very different position. It asks us to acknowledge that another person matters to us. And that means their response puts us in a very vulnerable spot. So when we're getting curious about our needs and our wants, I think there's another question worth asking. What feels vulnerable about knowing this? This is also where we can get confused about what it means to acknowledge a need or a want. Knowing what I need doesn't mean someone else is responsible for meeting that need. Knowing what I want doesn't mean I'm entitled to get it. We can recognize that we need connection and still take responsibility for how we seek connection. We can want reassurance from our partner and ask for it while recognizing that our partner gets to have their own experience. We can want something from another person and hear no and be okay. We can also want something that's not possible right now. Often we can want two things that conflict with each other. None of that means that we have to pretend that we never wanted it. That's where I think curiosity becomes important. Before we decide whether a need is reasonable or whether a want is practical, we can simply notice what's there. What do I need? What do I want? And maybe even, what does this tell me about myself? If I want more time alone, that tells me something. If I want more connection, that tells me something. If I want more creativity in my life, that's information. If I want adventure or stability or affection or challenge or rest, those wants give me information. They don't, however, give us instructions. We don't have to act on everything we discover. But if we immediately judge it or dismiss it, explain it away, or decide, I shouldn't want that, we lose the opportunity to learn something about ourselves. And I think that's part of what it means to become more connected to ourselves. Not getting everything we want or need, not expecting other people to arrange themselves around our wants and needs, but being able to know what's happening inside of us and allow that information to have a place in the decisions we make. Sometimes that might mean asking for something. Other times it means we meet that need ourselves. It might mean we accept that something wasn't available. And other times it'll mean grieving what we did not get that really mattered. And sometimes it means discovering that we've been living with a set of options for so long that we haven't asked ourselves what we would choose if we started with the question, what do I want? So maybe over the next few days, spend some time getting curious. Pay attention to what happens when someone asks you what you want. Maybe it's something as simple as, where do you want to eat? Do you know? Do you immediately say, I don't care? Do you ask what everyone else wants? Do you need to know the options before you can answer? I think there can also be nuance. Sometimes I don't care really means I don't care. Maybe there are 5 restaurants everyone is considering, and you know there's something you like at all 5 of them. You might genuinely be happy to go wherever the majority of the group wants to go. We can know that one restaurant wouldn't be our first choice and still decide that being with the people you're with matters more to you than where you eat. That's different from not knowing what you want in the first place. There will also be times when your preference matters more than others. For example, there are restaurants I don't want to go to because they smell fishy, and that makes me nauseous. There are certain grocery stores I will not go into because they smell fishy. It doesn't matter that I can go to that restaurant and order chicken. I'm still going to sit in a restaurant that smells like fish. And I know I won't be able to enjoy that. So in that situation, I might say, I can't do that restaurant. Could we choose somewhere else? Or I can't do that restaurant, but I'm fine with these others. If we're talking about a seafood restaurant where I know the smell alone is going to make me nauseous, I know enough about myself to say that one doesn't work for me. I remember having a conversation with a friend when I was about 45 years old. We were talking about ourselves, and I said, one thing I know for sure about myself is that I don't like seafood. Actually, I don't like anything that comes out of water. I had tried. I had cooked it all the ways people told me I needed to. I would say, I don't like seafood. And they would say, oh, you have to try it this way. So I would try it that way. I had eaten seafood prepared so many different ways. And at some point, I thought, you know what? I'm ready to just say, I don't like it. And from this point going forward, I don't need to try to keep convincing myself that maybe I should like it. I think there's something about knowing ourselves in that as well. Sometimes curiosity means being open to discovering something new about yourself. And sometimes we've gathered enough information and we can just say what we know. I don't like seafood. That's a preference. It doesn't need to mean anything more than that. So if everyone else wants to go somewhere and there's something on the menu I can enjoy, I'm probably fine going along with the group. But if we're talking about a seafood restaurant where I know the smell alone is going to make me nauseous, then I know enough about myself to say, that one doesn't work for me. Can we go somewhere else? Not every want has the same weight. Not every preference needs to be advocated for. We can know what we want and choose to go along with what someone else wants. That can be healthy. Sometimes we genuinely don't have much of a preference. And other times we know what isn't going to work for us, and we need to speak up. The goal isn't always to make sure that we get our way. The goal is to stay connected enough to ourselves that we know the difference. I think we can bring that same kind of curiosity to our needs. What happens when you notice a need? Do you simply recognize it, or do you start evaluating it? Asking yourself, should I need this? Maybe I'm asking for too much. Why does this matter so much to me? Shouldn't I be able to do this on my own? Pay attention when the words, I should just be grateful, show up. Not because gratitude is a problem, but because it might be worth exploring what comes after the word just. I should just be grateful, and therefore what? I shouldn't want more. I shouldn't be disappointed. I shouldn't acknowledge what's missing. I shouldn't ask for something different. You might also notice whether there are areas of your life where you know yourself quite well and others where you don't. Maybe you know exactly what you want professionally, but you have a harder time knowing what you want in your relationships. Maybe you have strong preferences about how you spend your time, but you have difficulty identifying what you need emotionally. Maybe You know what you want when you're by yourself. But when someone else enters the picture, their wants become much easier to hear than your own. When our kids were young, we rarely made it to the movies. And we enjoy going to the movies. My husband's birthday is in August, so the end of the summer blockbusters. We would both take the day off on his birthday. We'd have somebody come watch the kids, and we would spend the entire day going to see all the movies, going from one to the next to the next. And they were movies that he wanted to see. He made the plan. He picked the movies because it was his birthday. And sometimes he'd say, I feel bad picking all the movies. And I would say, it's your birthday. You get to choose. I didn't dread going to any of the movies. It was actually something we looked forward to every year. And then our kids got older and had plans of their own. We can go to the movie and we don't need to get anybody to watch the kids. We don't need to see movie after movie after movie all on the same day. Maybe, like I've talked about earlier, you have carried an unshared self. You know more about what you think and feel and want than the people around you would probably guess. I don't think the goal is to force yourself to have an answer. If you genuinely don't know what you want, I don't know is also information. The next question may simply be, what do I notice? What am I drawn toward? What do I look forward to? What do I miss? What do I wish I had more of? And what do I feel disappointed about when I don't get? Those things may give us clues. Because I think becoming more connected to our needs and wants is less about coming up with the right answers and more about developing curiosity about our own internal experience. And maybe over time, I don't know, starts becoming, I'm not sure yet, but I'm getting information. I think there can be something really freeing about getting to know this part of ourselves. To be able to say, I like this. I don't like that. I need this. I wish I had more of that. Not because every one of those things has to be acted on, but because we don't have to talk ourselves out of our own experience. That's a big part of what it means to become more fully ourselves. Not a version of ourselves that's less demanding or less grateful, but a version that has a little more room in our life for who we are. And I think there's something really beautiful about being able to know yourself well enough to say, this is me. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.